an original MCM production.
Now, past president Chris Jacobs will introduce our speaker. Chris assures me that he's never tried this stuff, so here he is.
That's one area in which Bill Clinton and I diverge, but I won't get into that. I'm honored today to introduce today's speaker, Rob Henken, who is a friend, a neighbor, a fellow parent. He reminded me that we did not come in second in the North Shore Little League. Our A's came in first, our sons, many years ago. We were blessed with Rob being brought to Milwaukee by two things. One, his wife, Barry Joseph, who's a wonderful woman. And the other was, I believe he was recruited by Gary Grunow to take a look at the mass transit and light rail here in Milwaukee. He's been the go-to guy for any sort of policy issue where you would like the numbers to be crunched and the facts to be revealed without any advocacy taking place. And I say that because Rob is somebody who has worked in Scott Walker's administration, and Scott was very happy with his work, and at the same time has many friends on the other side, such as Chris Abley, with whom he has worked as well. The purpose of the Public Policy Forum, and I'm a trustee there and I'm on the research committee, is to come up with unbiased research so that we in Milwaukee can make policy decisions about where we're going as a metropolitan area and as a culture, so to speak. And so they look at broad-based issues, not unlike the one we're going to talk about today. I believe this is probably our first marijuana talk at Rotary, but it is an issue that the Public Policy Forum brought out as a question to look at after Alderman Nick Kovac made some overtures in the Common Council about it. My associate Liz Miles and I from Davis and Kielthau have had the opportunity to work together with Rob's research staff on this project because we work for many municipalities and we were able to provide some of the information that led to what you're about to hear. And it is the first in a two-part process of research, which I'll let Rob explain because obviously this is, I think, too important of a project to simply look at and put on the shelf and walk away. Since we see states one by one changing their statewide laws, we have to be up on what's going on this subject. Sorry for the long introduction, but Rob Henken, if you would take the dais and tell us what you found.
First of all, thanks very much, Chris, for that very nice introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. You know, I'm just going to get some puns out of the way just to start. So I know there's been a lot of buzz around my presentation at Rotary today. I know you all have some very high expectations for me. And really, it is high time that the Downtown Rotary, Milwaukee Rotary Club talked about this issue. So I guess the other way I'll start is by saying, so as I was thinking back to the various times that I've presented to this Rotary Club, the topics have been rather dry. City budget, county budget, Milwaukee Public Schools statistics. So you may be wondering, why is it that the Public Policy Forum, we are known as a 102-year-old organization that is relatively staid and certainly very fact-based and research-oriented. Why is it that I'm here today to talk to you about, while we can joke, is a serious issue? How did the Public Policy Forum decide to go about researching this matter? And Chris actually stole a little bit of my thunder. This was an issue that came to the forefront of debate at the Milwaukee Common Council earlier this year. There was discussion about changing the municipal ordinance in the city of Milwaukee, which I'll get into in just a second. And it occurred to us that there's not a lot of public understanding understanding as to why it even is that municipalities can carve out their own policies with regard to marijuana, given that, as most of you know, marijuana possession and usage is prohibited by federal law. So we thought there was a need for public education around the issue. We also tend to see issues like this be embroiled in very highly charged rhetorical debates. We hear lots of information tossed about by proponents and opponents, and we thought this was precisely the type of issue that could benefit from a staid, fact-based research group just laying it out for people. So that's what I'm going to try to do for you this afternoon as well. Let's start with that question that I raised just a second ago, which is what does the law say about marijuana possession, and what does that mean with regard to what a state or a municipality can do? So marijuana is strictly possession, use, sale, you name it, strictly prohibited by federal law. Marijuana is classified as a Schedule I drug. That equates it with heroin and LSD. Cocaine, by the way, is a Schedule II drug, not considered, per the federal classification, to be as dangerous as marijuana. What you see on the screen are the federal penalties for marijuana possession. First conviction of any amount of marijuana, from a joint to several ounces, can be punishable with up to 1 year in jail and a minimum fine of $1,000. You can see the penalties for second convictions and third and subsequent convictions. So indeed, there is a strict prohibition per federal law. However, and there are judges and many attorneys in this room, and I am not an attorney, so I need to be careful with my legalese here, but essentially, while federal law can preempt state law and municipal law, in this case, the federal government, as a matter of policy, has sort of allowed states to establish some of their own ground here. Now, this issue, of course, really came to a head when Colorado and Washington state made the decisions to fully legalize marijuana. And as a result of that, in 2013, the U.S. Attorney General issued an opinion which essentially said that we are interested in prohibiting marijuana usage by minors. We are interested in preventing the interstate commerce of marijuana. We are interested in prosecuting when marijuana is associated with other criminal activities. But for the most part, other than that, we are going to let states decide for themselves. So what you're seeing in this slide is the states that have actually taken action on their own, notwithstanding the federal law and what it says. So we see the states that are in green, 4 states have fully legalized. Now, by fully legalized, we mean not only that possession and use by individuals over the age of 21 is legal, but the commercial sale of marijuana is legal. In other states, captured by the blue and the red, there has been decriminalization. Now, what does decriminalization mean? That essentially means that while marijuana possession is still not legal, to the extent that you are caught, it is going to be treated as a municipal violation, a civil violation, as opposed to a criminal violation. So typically that is accompanied by a fine, and also in many states there are restrictions. There's a barrier, so 25 grams or more would not be included in the decriminalization. But for small amounts, it is treated akin to a parking ticket in terms of it goes to, it's a municipal ordinance violation, and essentially the penalty is a fine, which if you fail to pay it, of course, can result in jail time, but typically no arrest is made and no criminal prosecution. 23 states have legalized the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. And so in the red, we see those who have both authorized that use and decriminalized. So a variety of different states taking a variety of different actions across the country. And as Chris said, more and more are looking at this. There are likely to be ballot questions in California, in Michigan, in Massachusetts, just to name a few, in November of 2016. So this continues to be a very fertile area of legislative activity. In terms of our own state of Wisconsin, before we get into Milwaukee and municipal law, it's very important to understand the Wisconsin policy context. So here in the state of Wisconsin, right now, we do have some limited degree of decriminalization. Municipalities, if they choose, can pass ordinances that allows them to treat first-time possession of 25 grams or less of marijuana as municipal violations. You may be wondering, how much is 25 grams? It's a little less than an ounce. So in our report, which by the way, the full report is available on our website, we showed a photo of the New York City police chief holding up a bag of oregano. So it's like one of those plastic bags that you would take with your liquids in the airport. A bag that size filled with marijuana is about 25 grams. So in the state of Wisconsin, municipalities have that option. Now, first-time criminal possession, so in other words, your second offense. So your first offense can be treated as a municipal violation, depending on the municipality in which you live. For your second offense, or your first-time criminal possession, that is typically treated as a misdemeanor that can result in a fine of up to $1,000 and 6 months in jail. For second and subsequent criminal offenses, the district attorney does have the ability, and often makes use of it, to charge those crimes as felonies, and the fine then grows to up to $10,000 and/or imprisonment of up to 3.5 years. Now, there was a very important and very little publicized change in state law that occurred in April of 2014, just a little over a year ago. That now allows those municipalities that choose to do so to change their ordinances so that they are able to issue municipal citations for second and subsequent offenses when the possession involves 25 grams or less. I should also add, in none of these cases, if there is intent to distribute, it's a whole other category that we're not even going to get into here. So we're just talking about possession of 25 grams or less. But a very key caveat is, provided that the district attorney's office declines not to prosecute, or declines to prosecute. So we'll get into in just a second why that's important. But this was a very critical change in the law that the city of Milwaukee, as we're about to learn, has responded to. So this is the statewide policy context. In the city of Milwaukee, again, as Chris said, there was a recent legislative effort to change the law. The change in the municipal ordinance did take place. But let's first talk about what the law said prior to June of this year. Prior to June of this year, in 1997, actually, the city of Milwaukee did vote to change its ordinance to abide by what was then the state statute, which said that you can treat a first offense of 25 grams or less as a municipal violation. So that legal structure was put in place in 1997, and prior to June of 2015, your first offense would result in a municipal ticket in a range of $250 to $500. For second and subsequent offenses, those would be charged as criminal offenses under state law. It's also important to recognize that in addition to the forfeiture of $250 to $500, there are also various court fees and surcharges that get tacked on. So one of the concerns that was raised by Alderman Kovac and others was that the typical marijuana fine was $266. If you add the court fees and surcharges, that was a total fine of $396. And there was an argument being made that that fine was simply too high, that it was essentially being levied on poor citizens who were unable to pay it, and as a result, people were seeing time in jail for failure to pay the fine. We were using criminal justice resources that some would argue could be better used elsewhere. And so there was a push made to lower the amount of the fine. Under the original proposal that was introduced in the Common Council late last year, the fine would have been lowered to only $5. There was considerable debate about that. Finally, in early June, the council did pass a new ordinance. And according to this new ordinance, which is in effect today, A first offense, the municipal ticket, is now in the range of $0 to $50 instead of the $250 to $500. And the city also changed its ordinance so that for second and subsequent offenses, again, only marijuana, nothing else, and 25 grams or less, those can be pursued as municipal citations if the district attorney elects not to prosecute. The court fees and surcharges remain the same. So now, under the existing paradigm, the fine for a forfeiture is $26, would be the average, and the total fine would be $84. So that is the way City of Milwaukee municipal ordinance stands today. While this debate was going on, the Public Policy Forum thought it was very important to sort of test some of the premises that were being raised about our incarceration of people who could not afford to pay the onerous marijuana fine. So we requested and received a considerable amount of data from the Milwaukee Municipal Court. We saw that from the period of January 2012 through March of 2015, there were more than 4,500 total first-time marijuana possession cases. We also found, somewhat surprisingly, that in only 12 of those cases involving 11 individuals had there been jail sentences made. So the notion, and there could be all sorts of reasons to craft an argument for lowering the marijuana fine for first-time possession of 25 grams or less. But if the driving motivation was to ensure that we were not needlessly incarcerating poor Milwaukeeans, the data didn't bear that out. Now, we were very curious about this. I'm sure you are. Why? How could this possibly be? Is it because everybody's paying their fines? Well, we looked into that a little bit further and found no, that's not the case. In fact, the vast majority of the fines are not being paid. But there was a very important policy change made by the municipal court in 2012 that essentially said, we are not going to put people behind bars if their only violation is failure to pay a municipal fine. For a municipal violation, we're going to do everything we can to make you pay the fine, but we're not going to use up our scarce criminal justice resources and put you in jail unless you also have a criminal charge on your record. So the way the law works now, and I'm going to paraphrase very, very briefly, but if you fail to pay that fine, a warrant indeed can be issued for your arrest. MPD or the sheriff are not going out to people's homes to then arrest them. The only way that law enforcement will know that there is a warrant out for your arrest for failure to pay a marijuana fine is if you're picked up on something else. If you're picked up, you will essentially be told you now have to acknowledge that you owe this fine and you have to agree to appear in court, but you're let go. And that process has to play itself out 4 times typically before there would be a consideration of an actual jail sentence. So again, the conclusion in looking at this data was maybe all sorts of reasons to look at the fine. But again, that driving, if our driver here is, we don't want to put people behind bars. These are people who, as a society, we should have an interest in making sure that they can gain employment or keep the employment they have, and putting them behind bars for a small marijuana infraction may not be in our best interest. Again, I'm not saying this is my view, I'm saying this is the view that is espoused by many. If that's your issue, then the first time possession and the amount of the fine wasn't necessarily the problem. We did find, however, that again, if that's your issue, then perhaps another area to look at are these second and subsequent offenses. Because there are people who are being picked up on charges involving possession of 25 grams or less for a second or subsequent time. And those cases are being prosecuted by the district attorney's office. And those individuals are winding up both spending time in jail pre-disposition and also being sentenced to time in jail or prison. So the real sort of epiphany that came to us in terms of analyzing this data is that again, if that's our concern, if we're worried about we're spending too many resources on these relatively minor marijuana infractions, and that we are needlessly and unfairly, and in some cases discriminatorily, putting people behind bars, that perhaps we ought to be taking a closer look at how we are treating second and subsequent offenses in terms of convictions or possession of 25 grams or less. We did find that for these second and subsequent, there is a racial disparity here. Does that mean there's racism? We can't tell you, but the data show that African Americans are being convicted at a rate for second and subsequent possession of small amounts of marijuana at a rate that far exceeds their proportion of the overall Milwaukee County population. And this slide actually shows Milwaukee County data, not City of Milwaukee. We also found other policy issues in the course of our research. We found that there is a vast difference in terms of the treatment of possession of 25 grams or less in the city of Milwaukee versus its suburbs. On this slide, I'm showing you the average fine amounts for first-time possession in a variety of suburbs. Now, this is a little misleading because you can look at Whitefish Bay and Bayside, whose average fine far exceeds that of the city of Milwaukee. But what you also need to know, which is covered in the report, is that there are deferred prosecution options available in those municipalities. So oftentimes, while that is the fine, if somebody agrees to take a class at MATC and stays out of trouble, then that fine can either be completely eliminated or it can be dramatically reduced. So again, in the body of the report, we discuss this. But the fact is that there are differences among the different municipalities in Milwaukee County, and arguably, things shouldn't be that way. We also found some other policy issues that I'll just go through very, very quickly. Interestingly, while our district attorney has been a national leader in terms of seeking diversion opportunities for nonviolent individuals convicted of drug possession charges, when it comes to marijuana, there aren't really diversion options. There are drug treatment programs for other types of drugs, but marijuana is not considered an addictive drug. And therefore, there aren't treatment programs to which individuals can be diverted if their drug possession charge is marijuana as opposed to another drug. There's a whole range of issues regarding the unpaid fines. Should we be doing more to collect those fines? Conversely, if we're not going to do more to collect the fines, should we be bothering to write as many tickets? A range of issues there. I talked about the incarceration issue. Another issue is driver's license suspensions. Now, there was also concern raised that we were unnecessarily and needlessly suspending people's driver's licenses for marijuana possession charges. The truth there is that for adults, that is not a penalty that is levied in the city of Milwaukee, but for juveniles it is. So if you're a juvenile and you are caught on a possession charge of a small amount of marijuana, you can and usually do have your driver's license suspended. So that's an issue that perhaps deserves some scrutiny. The public resources we're using. In this initial report, we couldn't get into that, but it's a very important question. Given the data that I just laid out, how much money are we spending to enforce these marijuana laws, and given the other public safety issues facing our community, should we contemplate at least redirecting some of those resources elsewhere? And there's a whole range of issues regarding consistency of enforcement. And again, I'm not an attorney. That being said, and I've said it twice now, I do appreciate the need, and I know there are prosecutors in the room, for prosecutorial discretion. I certainly appreciate the need to give police officers on the street some ability to decide on a case-by-case basis what they're going to do. But when we look at marijuana possession, particularly for small amounts, it is all over the board the way different individuals are treated, not only in the city of Milwaukee versus its suburbs, but even within the city of Milwaukee and within individual municipalities. And it at least suggests that perhaps we ought to be looking at greater consistency and sort of firm boundaries in terms of how we're going to treat possession of small amounts of marijuana. So that was the first part of our report, was to look at, again, what the current lay of the land was in terms of the law. We also spent a great deal of time looking at other cities. And Chris mentioned that we don't advocate at the Public Policy Forum, and so I'm going to decidedly try not to come off as an advocate. But we really wanted to look at what other cities were doing from a lens of those who really were doing something to relax their marijuana possession laws. Now, does that mean the Public Policy Forum thinks we should be doing that here? It doesn't. But that is where the debate was headed in the Common Council, so we thought there would be some value in seeing what other cities were doing when raising the same types of concerns about inappropriate use of law enforcement resources, racial disparities in terms of who we're arresting and putting in jail for possessing small amounts of marijuana, and asking questions related to workforce development and related issues about, is this really what we should be doing for what some consider to be a relatively minor infraction? So what other cities have been doing really can be lumped into three categories. One is adjusting law enforcement priorities. So Seattle, and this was prior to Washington State fully legalizing, did a ballot initiative that simply said that marijuana-related activities would be our lowest law enforcement priority. San Francisco, California did the same thing by a vote of its Board of Supervisors. That's one approach. Nashville, Tennessee just adopted a ballot initiative that tries to get at the issue another way. While state law prohibits possession of marijuana, the citizens of Nashville voted to prevent their tax dollars from being spent to prosecute on a criminal basis any violation of marijuana laws. So if you're looking for policy options of what the city of Milwaukee might consider doing, there's a range of options regarding adjusting law enforcement priorities. Another whole set is in terms of the real decriminalization. So ensuring that possession is only a civil offense. You see on the screen what Ann Arbor, Michigan, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania have done. What's important to note here is that for many of these cities, Philadelphia and Santa Fe in particular, it doesn't matter whether it's your first, second, third, or however many offense, the policy is that possession of, in the case of Santa Fe, up to an ounce of marijuana results simply in a maximum fine of $100. So we're not going to arrest people. The big distinction in terms of, from a policy perspective, in terms of making these municipal violations, is the arrest doesn't get made. It's just a ticket. So that means the individual doesn't have to be booked in the jail. It means the individual doesn't have to spend a day or two or three perhaps in jail waiting for the DA to decide whether or not he or she is going to prosecute. So if resources is your issue, then this might be an appropriate way to go. Other cities have gone even further and have simply eliminated penalties for possession. I don't know how many of you in this room know that in the city of Madison today, you can possess 112 grams of marijuana or less. So that's more than 4 times the 25 grams in Milwaukee. And there's no penalty. As long as it's in a private place, there is not only no criminal prosecution, but there's no civil violation either. Of course, you can't legally buy it, which begs the question, well, why is the law constructed this way? But that's been in effect since 1977. I can also tell you that on the UW-Madison campus, that is a different law applies. So you are not allowed on the UW-Madison campus. Not that that's ever stopped anybody. Portland, Maine, as you can see, public or private possession of up to 2.5 ounces in private use is allowed for adults. And of course, there's been a big controversy in Washington, D.C. Voters overwhelmingly voted to allow possession of up to 2 ounces and home growth of up to 6 plants. So while they have not gone to the full legalization of allowing you to commercially sell, you can grow it for your own use. However, the Congress has put a stop to that because of the unique way in which Washington, D.C. is governed. Closer to home, Chicago, interestingly, changed its law not too long ago. They now give the discretion to the police officer on the street to decide for him or herself. If you are caught with possession of less than 1/2 ounce, then the officer, whether it's the first, second, or subsequent, can elect to write you a ticket instead of arrest you. Interestingly, we did some digging into this, and even though this law was changed 2 years ago, they have found so far in Chicago that the vast majority of marijuana possession incidences, arrests are still being made. So for whatever set of reasons, the police officers are, for the most part, opting not to use this discretion, but that's what their municipal ordinance says. St. Louis has essentially decriminalized possession of less than 35 grams, that is for a first or a second offense, results in a summons, which is essentially a municipal violation. And in Detroit, adults can possess up to 1 ounce on private property with no penalties whatsoever. So, to conclude, we tried to put our heads we tried to get into the heads of Milwaukee Common Council members. Now, that may not be a real good idea to try to do, but we did it anyway. And to us, there's three reasons why one would logically argue for a relaxation of marijuana laws. So there's the set of individuals who believe that marijuana has limited effects when compared to other drugs. It should essentially be treated the same way as alcohol. If that's your belief, full legalization really would be the way you'd want to go, but it's really not an option within the confines of state law for the city of Milwaukee to consider fully legalizing, in other words, to legalize the commercial sale. A slightly narrower approach would be to legalize private possession of small amounts similar to Detroit or Madison. If conversely your rationale here is, hey, look, I think it should be illegal, but I acknowledge that there are higher priority law enforcement needs, and so I'm not interested in using as many law enforcement resources, then potentially you could go try to use that lowest law enforcement priority approach, though there'd be a question, is that really enforceable? And my guess is that if Chief Flynn were here, he would tell you that it's already a very low law enforcement priority. On the other hand, you could attempt to legalize possession of small amounts, or you could attempt to expand the universe of violations that are subject to municipal citation. For those who are most concerned because of perceived racial disparities and barriers to employment, any of these approaches could potentially be pursued, but again, taking a good hard look at how we want to treat any possession of 25 grams or less charge, and potentially looking at making all of those simply subject to municipal citation might be the most realistic and effective approach. We are now engaged, as Chris said, in the second phase of our research. We think there are a lot of unanswered questions that have been raised. We have not gotten into at all the public safety consequences and the public health consequences. And the fact that I'm not spending time on those does not mean that I don't think they're important. It simply means it was not within the purview of this initial research effort. And frankly, it's not going to be in the purview of our second research effort either. There's been a lot of research about the health effects of marijuana, and we are eagerly awaiting more data from places like Denver and Seattle about the law enforcement and public safety consequences if we were to legalize. Rather, our focus in phase 2 is going to continue to be on what the city of Milwaukee might wish to pursue. So we really want to define this universe. We want to know how many people are being arrested in a given year solely for possession of 25 grams or less of marijuana. Who are those people, and how many are only first or second offenses? Once we know that, we want to know of those arrested, how many are actually being prosecuted, what is the average length of stay in the jail, both pre and post conviction or in the House of Correction. Once we know the answers to those questions, we hope to be able to calculate how much we are spending on an annual basis to arrest, incarcerate, and prosecute low-level marijuana violators. And then we would be able to compare that to how much money it would cost if we simply decriminalized, and to do a little bit of a more careful look at what the public safety impacts of that might be. So I've exceeded my time by a little bit, but I think we still have at least 10 minutes for questions and answers. I think the brownies should have kicked in by now, so I'm now going to go to my psychedelic slideshow. Only kidding. But no, seriously, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
An MCM production.